Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Kiratane, Kiratane Hoş geldiniz herkes. We are extremely lucky this evening because we have Anissa Halou with us. Anissa Halou is one of the best-known food writers, not just in this part of the world, but in the whole world. But she concentrates particularly on the food of the Middle East, the Islamic world, her home in Lebanon, and you're part Syrian as well, I believe.
It's true.
Anyway, there's no, on the Mediterranean, there's probably no climate that she's not had a meal or given a recipe about. And she's the award-winning author of many cookbooks. The last and the latest has the interesting title of Feast, the food of the Islamic world, and which we hope to talk about. But we've managed to catch her in Istanbul, and we're very lucky to have her with us to talk to an audience. Let's start at the beginning, okay? And you seem like an intelligent woman. I mean, how is it that you ended up writing about food?
Well, it was a sheer coincidence, really. I wanted to write a book about collecting because I used to be in the art world and I collected ahead of the curve. So like I bought things because I didn't have that much money. I bought things that were not very fashionable and, created interesting collections without spending fortunes. And I thought there were many people like me who collected beautiful things and, were ahead of their time. And so I wanted to write about these people. And I got myself a literary agent who, because I'm Lebanese, decided to introduce me to a Lebanese friend of hers, who you might know, Zelfa Hourani, the niece of Albert Hourani, the historian.
Yes.
So we went to Zelfa's house and they started talking about cookbooks. And as I was listening to them, I was thinking there isn't a book on Lebanese food that is user-friendly for those who don't know the cuisine. So I kind of very rashly threw out a comment saying, well, I could write a cookbook on Lebanese food and I could write, my mother's recipes. Caroline Davidson, who's actually the daughter of Alan Davidson, one of the great people in the food world, immediately said, well, I have a publisher who's looking for somebody to write a book on Lebanese cuisine. And I said, well, I'm yours. I'm your person. I knew nothing about cookbooks. I didn't even respect cookbooks. I mean, I didn't think of them as a literary genre. And I had never written a recipe. And I just thought it can't be that difficult. So I said, great, I'll do it, thinking it would take 3 months. And then when I started writing the proposal, I realized that it was a much more, much more difficult and a serious subject. So Caroline took me to the Oxford Symposium of Food and Cookery, and I chose a few mentors, and I started collecting books. Also, I had a boyfriend then who was a very keen cook and had a collection of cookbooks. So I kind of raided his library, asked for his help, and it all came about. And instead of 3 months, I spent 3 years writing, testing recipes, collecting all my mother's recipes that were very vague. So I had to kind of make them, precise. And 3 years later, Lebanese cuisine came out and it was a success.
It's the standard book about Lebanese food. That's right. Well, and of course, the other coincidence is that Caroline Davidson, your agent, is my neighbor in London.
Exactly.
So many all roads lead to yourself. So what is special about Lebanese cuisine? How is it different from Turkish cuisine or any other cuisine?
Well, there are many dishes, many shared dishes, but Lebanese cuisine in particular is more vibrant, a lot more kind of raw vegetables, lots more salads. Funnily enough, when I come to Turkey, I'm not offered very many raw salads. There are lots of cooked vegetables in zeytin yadi and things like that. But Lebanese cuisine is kind of like vibrant, lemony, very fresh flavors, lots of textures. and then the meze spread is quite different from the one that you have in Turkey. So even though there are many shared dishes, whether in Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Turkey, Lebanese cuisine stands alone in that it's kind of more sophisticated, not as varied as Turkish because it's not as big a country. But, it's very difficult to talk about national cuisine, especially in a region like here that was one under the Ottoman Empire or Greater Syria. But it is kind of distinctive.
So, make this clear. Take a Lebanese meze and a Turkish meze that it resembles, and what's the difference between the two?
Okay, so if you take a Lebanese meze, you would have tabbouleh, for instance. You would have fattoush, two salads that you don't actually find here. Usually the salads here are cucumber, tomatoes, onion, maybe cooked sort of vegetable dishes, or raw, radishes, cucumbers, things like that. And the Turkish hummus is very different from the Lebanese hummus. Our hummus is plain sort of, chickpeas, tahini, lemon juice, no flavorings. Here they add cumin and a bit of olive oil, so it's kind of slightly different. Baba ganoush in Lebanon is kind of lemony. Here you'd have grilled aubergines, but not the sort of with tahini and lemon juice. You'd have cheeses here. In Lebanon, you wouldn't really have so many cheeses in a meze, but you'd have savory pastries. Then you have kofte. Here I've noticed when I used to go to Çiçek Pasajı, they would have the çiğ köfte. Is it the raw one?
The raw meat, yeah.
So it wouldn't be part of the menu of the restaurant. There would be guys who would bring it, and then you'd call the guy. And sometimes, I often thought, why would I buy raw meat on the street? Because it's a bit scary.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's kind of, I think the way I see it is that the flavors in Turkey are sort of more subtle. I wouldn't say bland, but they're kind of more on a same line, let's say, and kind of light. Whereas in Lebanon, you'd have more flavors, stronger flavors, more lemon, more olive oil, more fresher. So it is definitely, even though you would have similar dishes like the stuffed pine leaves, in Lebanon would be kind of smaller, less full of rice, and stronger sumac flavor, let's say. Whereas here they'd be kind of thicker, a bit more dense, and on the sort of bland side. So it's kind of, but then if you go to the southeast, then you'd have flavors that are closer to our flavors.
Two things. I don't know if you've ever seen this documentary called Whose Is This Song? It's by this Bulgarian documentary maker, Adela Biv. And basically she hears the song Üsküdar'a giderken, the one that Eartha Kitt made famous. And of course, everyone at the table is a Bulgarian, a Macedonian, a Turk, a Greek, and they say, it's our song. It's not your song, it's our song. We did it first. Is there a sort of food nationalism the same way, where this is the real way you make hummus, not the way you make hummus? Is it?
I think for those who are not particularly intelligent, there is, or for those who are not very well informed or not well traveled, there is this kind of slight fanaticism as to which dish belongs to whom. But if you've traveled all around, you would kind of try and concentrate on the variations more than on whose dish it is. So I'm not going to say hummus is Lebanese, because you find it in Turkey, you find it in Jordan, you find it in Palestine, and you find it in Syria. What is interesting is that in the north of Lebanon and in Syria, they don't add garlic to their hummus. And in Lebanon, we add garlic. And
I'm with you.
And if you go to the Club Daleb, and they have different, like on the meze, they have different hummus. And one is called hummus Beiruti. Mm. And it has parsley and garlic. So they're kind of variations rather than national dishes. But, according to my mother, I haven't actually tested that. She says tabbouleh is Lebanese. It is possible that tabbouleh is from the mountains of Lebanon. A dish from that particular part of Lebanon. Like kibbeh bisaniye as well, which you find here different with the kofte, the different variations in kofte. But the kibbeh balls exist everywhere, but the shape is different.
This is what they call in Turkey,
Yeah.
içli köfte.
İçli köfte.
Yeah.
So içli köfte in Turkey is long and oval. In Syria, it's round, and in Lebanon, it's fatter ovals and shorter. The mixture is more or less the same. The spicing is different, and the stuffing depends on where you are, but it's mainly it's basically meat, onion, and pine nuts. So, I'm not going to say it's definitely, I mean, if you think about history, the Ottoman Empire kind of gathered all these countries that are now different countries, but they were not countries, they were regions. But the mountains of Lebanon were autonomous for a very long time. And they were not that easily reachable. So I think each region had their own dishes that are particular to them. And then they got into the melting pot, basically. But because of the different countries and different cooks and the sort of evolution, they've changed slightly from one country to another.
Or even in one city. I mean,
exactly.
I've been, of course, we've all been to Gaziantep, which I regard as the gastronomic heart of Turkey. But
I agree.
And there you have families which don't speak to each other. And the mother won't speak to the daughter-in-law because they put sumac in the dolma or not, or how much they do this. I mean, is there such a thing as authentic food, do you think, or
I personally prefer to use classic rather than authentic. I mean, there is such a thing as authentic, especially now with chefs kind of doing fusion and using all these global ingredients and making up their own dishes without actually explaining where they come from. But I prefer to use the term classic. So you have classic recipes that, of course, have variations from family to family or from region to region. But, you can consider, kibbeh bisani made in a certain way as the classic way of making it. And of course, it's going to be made differently from, and then the families, as you say, like whenever I invite a Lebanese friend to my house and I make kibbeh bisani, the first comment is, it's nice, but my mother or grandmother or whatever, makes it this way. And maybe you should do it this way.
Do they get invited back? Or?
No. No, of course they do. So I think it's kind of interesting. But there are, like when I was in Gaziantep, I went to this wonderful cook who made something called omach. Omach is a kind of salad that is served in bowls. So she mixes, I don't think it has cucumber, but very finely diced tomatoes and onion and I don't know what, and pepper paste, and very, very thin crumbled bread. And she makes bowls. So you could consider this as a version of fattoush, which is a bread salad, but it's completely different. Not only that, but the flavor is completely different. So I've never had omach anywhere else. So it belongs to Gaziantep, but maybe it's Armenian. I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's Armenian. I think it's Turkish because I've never seen it in any other books. And I haven't seen it in books either. But, I can't say that I've studied all the Turkish cookbooks. So you have dishes that are very specific to their city or their region or their country, but it's more difficult to pinpoint the country, the national dish, rather than the regional or the city.
So let's go back to how you started out. I mean, did you always cook? Were you always interested in cooking? Did you always...
When I was young, I was a feminist, I kind of read Simone de Beauvoir when I was 16 and I kind of dreamt of, becoming a liberated woman living a kind of intellectual life in Paris. And one of the things I decided to do was not to cook. So when I came to London and I started living with the first man and last man I ever lived with, the first thing I told him, I said, don't expect me to sew your buttons and don't expect me to cook for you. So for 2 years, I think, I never cooked in Lebanon because my mother was a great cook. And for 2 years in London, I didn't cook at all. And I was very happy with my status, liberated status, until one day he invited a very glamorous blonde American friend of his to the house. And he asked me, what was for dinner. And I said, open the fridge and see what's in the fridge, and that would be dinner. But she cooked. I mean, whatever was in the fridge, she cooked. And all my feminist ideals went out of the window as I was watching him enjoying the food she had cooked. And I was thinking, well, maybe I should kind of change my stance a little bit. So I decided on a whim to invite all our friends to a Lebanese dinner party. I had never cooked Lebanese. I had cooked one Lebanese dish in my life, which was green beans in tomato sauce. And at 16 is a midnight thing, with my sisters. And it was the height of the Civil War, and it was the 6 months, I think, after 76, I can't remember, when I couldn't call my parents. So I had rashly invited about 30 people to a Lebanese feast in the 70s in London. The 70s, like ingredients. Forget it.
Yes, there was the Cyprus.
Yeah, on Moscow Road.
Yeah, I see. Yes, okay.
And so, there was a Lions Cafe and a kind of small supermarket I lived near Sloane Square. I mean, there was nothing. And so I thought, I have to prove myself. I can't fail. So I kind of zigzagged London. I think there was a Athena store, but there were other places I can't remember, to buy olive oil, burhol for kibbeh, chickpeas were not that difficult, but tahini, ingredients that, were kind of really not available.
Even garlic.
Even garlic. I mean, London in the 70s were the culinary desert.
Yeah.
So, but funnily enough, the fact that I was my mother's kitchen pest, my grandmother's, my aunt, that I was always in the kitchen with them, mainly because I was greedy, watching them cook and, wanting to taste everything they did. I cooked from memory, and it worked. I mean, how well it worked, I don't know, because my guests were European. And, I thought it was okay, but to be honest, I don't remember. It was practically 50 years ago. But I produced a meal for 30 people. Yeah. So I realized that I could cook after all. And from then on, I cooked for dinner parties, but I still didn't cook every day.
Actually, I can tell a similar story. Was that I'm not a professional cook, of course, but the way I started cooking was because the food at university was so terrible that and I was greedy as well. And then one night, with a bunch of friends, we decided we would have a Turkish feast, and of course, as you say, there was only one store in London on Charlotte Street which sold olive oil. Even
it was terrible.
You could get these things, and then then I had my Claudia Roden, and I had a friend who had a Greek mother, and she advised on the baklava.
Yeah, well, you see, I didn't have my mother to advise me, and I didn't know about Claudia Roden's cookbook because I didn't really use cookbooks.
Yeah.
I didn't use cookbooks because I didn't cook. So, but I think it was wonderful to be able, to realize that I hadn't wasted my time, spending all this time in the kitchen with my mother. And then I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the fact that I was successful as well, because it could have been a disaster. And I thought it was fun to cook for friends. I enjoyed the hospitality aspect and the gathering the people around the table and everybody saying, oh, it's wonderful, even though it might not have been wonderful. So from then on, and then when I lived in Paris, I had a great friend who was a wonderful cook, and I learned from her, about kind of French and other food. So I kind of started cooking. So by the time I decided to write a cookbook, I was actually more than a proficient cook. I was a good cook, but I wasn't a regular cook. And I wasn't a cook. I didn't know about writing about food. So I had the basis. I knew about ingredients. I knew about good food and everything. But I had to learn how to turn this into a profession.
Recipes, for example, recipes are a difficult thing, because I had this thing where the difference between myself and my mother is my mother would always write everything down, and she would have a half a teaspoon of this, a half a tablespoon of that. In fact, her edition of Julia Child had all the imperial British measurements converted to American measurements, so she knew just how much salt and how much pepper to put on each dish. But she was a very good cook. But I could never follow a recipe. I mean, I think I'm a good cook, but the whole idea of I read it through and I get the idea and then I do it. So what's it like to actually write a recipe if recipes on something that you learn by yourself?
Well, I think the most important part of there are several important elements of a recipe. First, that they should be precise and logical. And second, they should inspire. So, like, you don't cook by a recipe, but if you read a recipe and you think, oh, I like the sound of this, you will do it, the way you would do it, not following the recipe. So the reason why I took mentors is to actually understand how to write about food. And of course, I started reading cookbooks. And each person, one was an Afghan cookbook writer, another was actually a diet cookbook writer. And then there's Charles Perry, the medieval Arab expert, and others. And each one kind of gave me a sort of, gave me, it's not training, but gave me an insight on how to write, either about food, the history. I spent time in the British Library. I mean, a lot of cookbooks have recipes and no introduction and no social context, no history. I wanted to approach it more from a cultural point of view. So, but I also wanted my recipes to be workable, to be user-friendly, and to be workable. So I spent a lot of time adjusting, because my mother wrote me all the recipes in Arabic. And they were all like 3-4 lines, apart from the ingredients. And every recipe finished with, cook until, in Arabic, اطبخي لا ينضج, cook until done. So here I say, Mom, what does it mean, cook until done? Half an hour, an hour, I mean, we need to tell the readers how long it's going to take. And then she would say, oh, a handful of this and a coffee cup of that and a glass of this. And she still uses these measurements. I mean, of course, she's cooked for all her life. She's 91. She knows exactly how, she doesn't have to measure anything. But I was writing not for myself even, but for, people who didn't know, either didn't know the cuisine or had never cooked it. So they needed to be able to. And that was wonderful, because that's where the success of the book came. I wanted to write down my recipes, and I wanted them to be, the book to be useful for those who had left during the Civil War and were not lucky like me to see everything done at home and to see the markets and all this. And I still get emails now from kind of Arab Americans, Lebanese emigres, whatever, saying that they refer to my book as, I exaggerate, as the Bible, but it's really precious for them, because they can reproduce their grandmother's dishes, whom they hadn't cooked with. So, I was very pleased it is difficult to write a recipe if you think about it. Initially I thought it's nothing, but you have to kind of itemize the ingredients in order of use. You have to kind of have the right measures. And you have, in your explanations, in the method, you don't want to patronize the reader. You want to explain, but not overdo it and not underdo it, not cook until done doing it.
But, the difficult thing, of course, is that the ingredients are so different. I make a confession here that I did this sort of pre-diabetes course online, just sort of stopped me from getting even more sort of obese and unhealthy than I am. And one of the things the instructor said was, when you go shopping, have a list and just buy the things on the list. And I thought, I'd rather die. The whole notion of cooking is shopping, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I can hear. I remember going to hear Alice Waters at some food conference, slow food conference, saying, when I described to someone what I was doing, they said, "That's not cooking, that's shopping." So, how if you're living in Dearborn, Michigan, and you're trying to make Arabic food, and you're living in Beirut, the shopping is so much different. How does a cook compensate for that? Cooking outside the country where the food belongs, as it were.
Well, I think the one thing is for sure is that it's very rare to be able to reproduce the taste of home exactly, because, as you say, the ingredients are different. The tomatoes in Lebanon taste completely different from the tomatoes in London. but they don't taste different from the tomatoes in Sicily, except that in Sicily they don't use herbs. So if I want to make a tabbouleh and I need parsley and mint, I cannot find the right parsley or mint. I would find the great tomatoes, but not the herbs. So you compensate by using what you have and explaining that the flavor is going to be slightly different, or even the texture. So overgrown parsley is going to make a kind of rougher tabbouleh than the tender parsley that you buy in Lebanon. And sometimes, if you don't find the ingredient, well, there are cookbook writers who substitute. I prefer not to substitute. So if there is an important ingredient that you cannot find, somewhere, I prefer not to give the recipe. But let's say Arabic ice cream uses salep as a thickener, and Turkish ice cream.
Mm.
So you can't buy salep in Europe or in America. But actually, if you use cornstarch, it's an acceptable substitute. You're not going to get the chewy and stretchy, characteristic of this dondurma or the Arabic ice cream.
Marash dondurma, yeah.
But you will get a very good ice cream. So that I accept as a substitute. But if you can't find pomegranate molasses, and it's an important ingredient for your dish, then I'm not going to give a recipe for that dish.
Eat a hamburger instead. Yeah, that's right. Well, since you mentioned Arabic ice cream, should I have you read it, or shall I can read it? The thing you wrote in the Guardian about the thing that cheered you up during the pandemic.
You read it.
Okay, I'll read it. Okay, so this is the things that got you through the pandemic, and you started making bouza, which is Arabic ice cream, if I'm pronouncing it right. Here is it. I had all the ingredients in my pantry. This is your pantry, not everyone's pantry. Best quality salep, a thickening of ground and dried wild orchid roots from Safranbolu in Turkey. That was very thinking ahead to get that, I'd consider. Mastic from Chios, rose and orange blossom water from Lebanon. I was able to buy unpasteurized milk from a woman in a nearby village who had 200 cows grazing in the mountains. I also had Kashmiri saffron. I spent days whisking salep into simmering milk to give it the incredible chewy and stretchy texture that is so typical of bouza, to make the base for either the pure milk version, flavored with rosewater and mastic, or the Iranian bastani, flavored with ground saffron infused in rosewater. I had ice cream in the morning, in the afternoon, and before going to bed. Truly the best thing I had all this summer. Well, you can't go to Sainsbury's and hope to find, 200 cattle sort of with unpasteurized milk. But I guess this is for you and not for everyone else. But it just goes to show that some cupboards are better equipped than others.
That's true. But I mean, the thing is that living in Sicily, they love their own food. They're not at all global. In London, you would find, now in London, you would find anything you want and everything you want. But in Sicily, it's impossible. So I imported all my ingredients from London.
But there is a point there, isn't it? It used to be the case in Turkey that there was no foreign food. The foreign food was a kebab that came from Diyarbakir. It wasn't Chinese or Indian. I always had this theory that Turks hate Indian food because it's just contrary to every principle of cooking that they ever had. But was it because the food was so bad in London that they had to look elsewhere, or what makes a cuisine? When do countries suddenly go international and start importing elements?
First of all, the food was very bad in London.
I remember.
In the 70s, it was impossible to eat well. Definitely not outside. And the only good food you got was in the country, in kind of English homes who appreciated good food, or in London at English people who cooked very simply but with great ingredients. But otherwise, you couldn't have good Italian, you couldn't have good Indian, you couldn't have good anything in the 70s. And then there were two, for me, there were two things. The Eurostar that kind of opened up England, and traveling. People started traveling, cheap travel. So people started being exposed to, like foreign food, whatever it was. And chefs, and also a kind of new breed of chefs who kind of were interested in ingredients, taking like, I think it was 94 that Fergus Henderson opened St. John's, the first St. John's, concentrating on offal. But basically, with this philosophy of great ingredients cooked simply. And then others, Alistair Little, who kind of was more into Italian food, and also great ingredients. I mean, there were few influential chefs in the late 80s, early 90s who kind of influenced a whole lot of, Simon Hopkinson as well, Jeremy Lee, and lots of, Jeremy was a bit too young then. But, they were all kind of English chefs who were open to international cuisines, but also open to kind of particularly fine ingredients, concentrating on ingredients. And it kind of went from there. And then, Turkish restaurants opened, Japanese restaurants. I remember going to one Japanese restaurant in 1974 or 75 up in Marylebone. It was probably the only one. And hardly anybody knew about sushi. So all this kind of slowly opened up London to fine dining. I mean, fine dining, good dining, not fine dining, upmarket dining. And the scene changed. But the scene was changing everywhere as well. Funnily enough, in Paris, it went backwards. I mean, like the French restaurants started, the brasseries or whatever, started using kind of catered, as against, you ate better in London later, in the late 90s and early 20s than in Paris. But now Paris is kind of having a sort of revival.
That's reassuring to hear, I would say. So you mentioned offal, and you wrote an offal cookbook. Now, offal in the sense of the Turkish word is so great, sakatat.
Which means the offcuts,
that's
right?
It's and there used to be, they don't exist anymore. There used to be shops in Turkey where you would just have the innards hanging in the window, the whole, what they would call a set, so you'd have even the lungs and
everything,
and the spleen and the liver and the thing. And I mean, it was sort of off-putting, I have to say. I don't miss them very much, but what attracted you to offal?
Actually, it was in my Lebanese cookbook, the first book. I wanted to have a chapter on offal because we use them in Lebanon, and we have a no waste policy in cooking, that you use everything, and some of the dishes were great, and I wanted to include it in my book. And Caroline, our friend, told me not to. And that rankled with me, not to have these very important and classic recipes, or authentic or classic, as a chapter in my book. And it kind of rankled. And I kept wanting, to write about offal. And then Fergus opened his restaurant. And I thought, well, maybe now is the time to write about offal. So I was discussing it with Caroline, and again, a publisher wanted somebody to write a book about offal. It was Absolute Press, and it was either me or Tom, the owner of Prospect Books. I forgot his second name now. It was either me or Tom to write the book. So at the symposium, I went to Tom and I said, do you mind if I write it instead of you writing it? Because I really want to write a book about offal. And he said, sure, go ahead. And I was commissioned to do it. Initially, I wanted to do a really comprehensive book, like an encyclopedia. But the advance was so miserable that I couldn't.
I must say, the one thing I don't like is spleen. Spleen is really nasty.
You haven't had a proper... There's a wonderful... dish in Lebanon, which is spleen stuffed with coriander and garlic and braised in vinegar. And it has this incredible sort of melting texture and is slightly sour and pungent flavor. And of course, the spleen sandwich in Sicily, in Palermo, that is incredible. So if you come to Sicily, I'll make you try.
Okay, so I'm just trying to remember the word for spleen in Turkish. Never mind. What is it? Dalak. Dalak. That's it. Dalak.
In Arabic, it's tal, so it's very close.
No, we used to boil it for the cats.
Oh.
and the house stank. It was.
Yeah, it has a strong. Yeah.
But never mind. We'll move on to something more pleasant, I think. But so the offal you wrote about wasn't just Lebanese. It was global.
Yeah, Chinese. I mean, everything. I mean, I kind of tapped into my friends. Like I went to Fuchsia Dunlop for Chinese recipes and. I can't remember who for the Italian recipes. And of course, I collected books as well. And I always cross-reference, recipes that I'm given. I kind of cross-reference them against the same recipe, but in different books. So to make sure that I'm getting it right.
You said you write about the sort of social aspects of eating, and of course this I do restaurant reviews, and I find it actually hard to write about the food. I'm much more interested in what's going on at the next door table or what's happening. I mean, is there a difference between a meal in Lebanon and a meal in Paris? I mean, not just the food, but the way people approach the table. I mean, the Turkish word sofra it's like
gathering.
Means everything. Yeah. It's not just the food; it's the whole ambience, I think.
Well, I would say that I would choose another example than the French, because the French are very convivial and very much into eating. So wherever you have a food culture, like in Lebanon, China, France, Italy, the meals are kind of similar from the point of view that people enjoy being together and they talk and they share. I mean, not all cuisines have a kind of sharing aspect, but there is a kind of there's conviviality around the meal and joy. I mean, unless they're fighting, but because you can also fight around the dinner table. Whereas in England, in England in the past, it has changed a lot. But in kind of like Anglo-Saxon cultures where food is not important, you eat to live, and you don't live to eat like me and other people. There is a kind of restraint around the meal. And the meal is not particularly abundant or, appetizing. In the old days in London, it definitely wasn't appetizing. So abundance is more like Lebanon. You'd have a lot of food on the table. A sort of like a method is more like the French, because you have the starter, the main course, and the dessert. So it's all structured. It's much more structured. But the social feeling is the same, because people are happy to eat and are happy to be together to eat. Whereas in some countries, they're not. They just eat because they have to eat.
It's like, what was the film, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, where they sit around the table to go to the loo, but then they disappear into a little room to eat. Yes, I guess.
So, that was an amazing scene.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think that what is interesting is I was at an event in Italy recently, which was Women in Food. And all the women who write, we had a panel on writing about food. And we all said the same thing, mothers, grandmothers, kind of having these recipes that were not precise, that we had to adjust them. And the joy that everybody had sharing, the food, being with the family. The kitchens, Arab kitchens. There was a wonderful Tunisian film, I think, called The Silence of the Palace. And it was all in the kitchen with all these women cooking and the children and everything. There's a wonderful sense of community around food in the countries where food is important.
The book, your latest book, I suppose, the Feast, the Food of the Islamic World, that covers a huge geographical area, and the Islamic world is enormous. How did that work into your scheme of things? What is it? Is there something about Islam, or was this just a hook on which to explore a larger region?
No, it was something about Islam. It was actually the idea came gradually, because my then New York agent wanted me to do a comprehensive book on Middle East, a really serious book, big book on Middle Eastern food. And I didn't want to because Claudia had written. I mean, even though I would have added a lot of fresh material.
This is Claudia Rodin.
Yeah, Claudia Rodin had written a book. Paula Wolfert in America had written. I wanted to do something much more fresh, and so I kind of said to David, my then agent, that I wasn't really keen on doing it, and I kept thinking about the idea of a serious book. A kind of comprehensive encyclopedia-like book. And then I thought, there is so much negative feeling towards Islam. I was thinking Claudia Rodin had written a book about Jewish food. There are lots of books about Jewish food. There was not one single book on Islamic food, or the foods of Islam, as I called it then. And so I thought it would be a wonderful way to present the religion and its people from, in a positive light from a food angle. So I started thinking about it, and I started looking at the Muslim majority countries. And it turned out that Indonesia, which I knew nothing about, was the biggest.
Yeah.
And of course, the Middle East I knew very well, and other countries. So I kind of put a proposal together. And I wasn't quite sure whether people would be interested or not, but I thought I would still give it a try. And I realized then, because I did the skeleton of the book and the list of recipes, that it was going to be a serious undertaking. Because of course, apart from the 1.25 billion Muslims in the world, it was, as you say, geographically. But funnily enough, geographically, it followed the arc of the empires. Indonesia was more further, but it still was like when Islam came about and expanded. So I proposed it, and the first publisher who accepted it was in England. But again, the advance was too little for the work that involved, because I intended to travel to most of these countries. And so luckily, an American publisher, accepted it. And I started working on it, and it took...
And it became a very famous book. It won the James Beard...
it's true. But it took many years, like practically 6 years of research and writing and traveling. But I loved doing it. I was very happy working on it because it was very, very interesting. And also, it was Islam. People think about Islam, terrorism, terrible negative things, but it's a great civilization. History and the food as well.
So was there an underlying current in all these countries, from China to, I don't know if you covered the black
I went to Senegal.
Senegal.
I wanted to go to Burkina Faso and Mali, but I didn't go because I didn't feel safe on my own. I think, no, there wasn't an undercurrent. I think, first of all, Muslim culture in general is a very welcoming, hospitable culture. So, like when I was in Uyghur country, as soon as I said Salam Alaikum, in fact, it was one of my most favorite travel experiences. They were wonderful people. As soon as I said Salam Alaikum, people opened up. And as a woman alone, I didn't suffer. I didn't have any prejudice. Sometimes they wouldn't let me take photographs, but that was it. And on the whole, when I explained what I was doing, they were all happy to help.
That's good. Let me ask you, let's change the subject just a little bit. If you write about the food of a country, you're sort of writing about the food of, I guess, everyday people, the food that people make in their own homes, in their own kitchens, as opposed to the food that's carefully sculpted and crafted in a sort of high-tech kitchen somewhere in San Francisco or whatever. I always had this notion that Turkey was a country, where the greatest celebrity chef was your mother, and that the whole notion of a chef as being a celebrity or a personality in their own right was, it just didn't fit in. But of course that's changed now. Now there are sort of, Michelin has come to Turkey. There are now, chefs who have signature dishes, etc., etc. So I always had this notion of craft and art, as it were. The craft was somehow anonymous, and that art had, you could make money out of it, I guess. Has the food in the Middle East change that way, or is there a change in the way people eat, or?
There is a change in the way kind of young people eat, for sure. I mean but that applies everywhere. Although, like in the West, the young people are more foodies now than they ever were. I think the notion of the home cook being the star is absolutely key to the Middle East. It is, they are the best cooks, regardless of the arty chefs or whatever. And I like the idea of craft and art, but home cooks can also produce art. You know, when a woman, a home cook, invites her family or friends for dinner and produces like a dozen dishes, you know, practically overnight, for me it's art, you know. It's not, I mean, I was at a friend in Saida in the south of Lebanon a few days ago, and she made a fabulous lunch that, you know, we had agreed the day before or 2 days before. I think the difference in the Middle East is that chefs are jobbing chefs. They're cooks. They're kind of salaried cooks, and they're mostly male cooks. I mean, when you have women in the kitchen, you probably have better food. In Turkey, the scene has changed, as you say, and now you have like artists, chefs. We're still a little bit behind in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, but there are lots of young, actually women chefs who are coming up and starting to kind of, you know, put their own mark on the dishes or make their own dishes. But to be honest, I'm a traditionalist and a purist. I prefer, I mean, on the whole, if I can eat a wonderful woman home cook's meal, I would be much happier than, I mean, I'm talking about the Middle East, I'm not talking about the West. So I don't know. For me, they're all artists. If they're great cooks, they're artists.
Well, there's artisans, as it were.
Yeah.
I mean, the great cathedrals are great works of art, but we don't know who made them. And,
exactly.
And they were made by craftsmen.
But great craftsmen. I mean,
that's right.
Who knew that? I mean, who were absolutely wonderful at their craft. So great cooks, whether in a restaurant or at home, but on the whole, they're at home because most of these great cooks are women. And it's very rare that they go out into the workforce, especially in a country that is very conservative. Like in Syria, when I went into the kitchens of the sweets maker in Aleppo, poor women were, they were not making the baklava, they were sorting the pistachios, but they were locked up in a small room to keep them away, or they wanted to be away, I don't know. But it was like so sad to go into the small room with all these women sorting out the pistachios, whereas all the men were in like, you know, in their t-shirts and kind of working away in the big kitchen. So they still don't have much of a place in the professional kitchens.
Okay, let me ask you the boring question. The inevitable boring question is, what food do you like, and what food do you like to make?
Well, the food that I like to eat, my favorite cuisine, number one, is Japanese food. And number two is Korean. And then my own food, and then other cuisines, and of course Italian as well. But what I like to make is kind of, on the whole, intricate dishes like kibbeh, bisaniye, which takes forever. And because I like the crafts, the crafts aspects of it. I like to kind of make the meat paste, you know, I like to lay it, and then I like to make the stuffing, and I like to decorate it. But then I also like to kind of do very simple dishes like spaghetti with botarga or whatever. But when I invite people, I'm always kind of cooking elaborate dishes rather than very simple dishes, because then I think if they're going to bother to come to me, I should put on, you know,
a show.
A show rather than just, you know.
And you teach as well, is that right?
Yeah. I used to more, I mean, I still teach a little bit, but when I had my loft in London, I taught, I gave cooking classes, and I enjoyed doing that.
What's the most difficult, what are people slow to learn and quick to learn?
Well, it depends on how enthusiastic they are, but on the whole, I mean, most people who come to cooking classes, they're coming for the entertainment rather than for the learning and for the meal at the end. But often they're kind of distracted. So, you're showing them how to make whatever. And then they come up with a question and you think, well, I've just shown you how to do this. But you have to be nice and not kind of tell them off. But I am an impatient teacher. So if somebody is a bit slow, I tend to kind of get a little bit impatient. But most people, if they come to a cooking class, they're coming, for the entertainment, but also because they're interested.
Are you an inventive cook or a good cook?
I think I'm a good cook. I'm not particularly inventive, mostly because I don't want to be inventive. I'm much, much more interested in perfecting classic dishes and making them my own without changing them too much, but making them more elegant, kind of changing instead of making them too lemony, kind of making them a little bit more subtle, reducing the fat, or not overcooking the vegetables. So I'm quite keen on sort of working on existing traditional dishes and perfecting them rather than coming up with my own whatever.
So a deconstructed Imam Bayildir wouldn't really do it for you, is that it?
It would do it for me if the chef was very talented. But often you don't, you need real talent to kind of play with the cuisine. You need to know the cuisine very well, and you need to be very talented to kind of produce a deconstructed, or whatever word you want to use, of a traditional dish. So then, I would be very impressed. But if it's a kind of, average rendition of something, or if the chef is not very talented, then I'm not interested. It's a bit harsh to say that.
But you can be harsh, it's okay.
But, you need talent in the kitchen. You have great cooks, you have proficient cooks, and you have average cooks, and you have bad cooks in the home as well. So I say home cooks are the best, but there are many home cooks that are not good at all.
So what makes a proficient cook a great cook? Where's the difference?
Well, I think they need a good palate to start with. And it's very rare for a proficient cook to become a great cook, because great cooks are they have the talent. They work on the talent. But, there is a wonderful word in Arabic. It says it's nafas, which is a breath.
Same in Turkish. Nefes, yeah.
So it's a kind of natural talent you have, and I'm sure it's related to the palate as well, because you have to have a great palate to be a great cook. So they have this, basic talent or original talent that they work on and develop. Like, I'm a better cook now than I was 20 years ago. And a proficient cook who's happy with being proficient is never going to be great. You have many basic, average cooks who think they're great cooks, but they're not. And if they think they're great cooks, they're never going to work on becoming better.
So in order to become better, is it finding an ingredient that didn't exist before, or cooking?
No, I don't think it's finding an ingredient that didn't exist. It's working on your technique, or it's working on your dishes. Like, okay, you made a very good stew, whatever. And then, because you have a very good palate, you think, well, I think I could have added a little bit more cinnamon, or it was a touch salty, or the sauce was a bit liquid. Maybe the meat was a bit tough. So you kind of there are many elements to a dish that were not perfect that you can then work on and make perfect. And then you become a great cook.
But self-criticism is the key here. But maybe this is our last go. I think an hour's gone by, which is our time. But you'll have to come back again. We'll have to do this all over again when you've written the next book. But I mean, I almost forgot my question.
Did you really forget it?
I think I'm having a senior moment. Yes, I think. Never mind. Perhaps we should just stop there when we're ahead. And Afiyat Olsen. I am reminded, however, where I did once decide that, this Ramadan sweet that they make here, goulash, which is made with these starchy layers, and I thought, oh well, maybe I could use the same thing and make something savory out of it, and that would be interesting. So I bought one of these things, which I'd never bought before, and I put it in the cupboard, and I said, one day I'll get it there. And I think it sort of crumbled into mold before I got around to it.
And so you never
I never did it, but perhaps.
But it's a wonderful. I wouldn't call it pastry. It's like a wafer.
It's a wafer. Yeah.
Then they put in milk. In Lebanon, here they do something very interesting, which is like a pie, multi-layered. In Lebanon, we soak it and then we make. We roll it around a sort of semolina, sweet semolina, thickened semolina filling, and then fry it. It's called also collage, and it's either eaten raw or fried, and it's the quintessential Ramadan sweet, and you find it everywhere on the street. It's a difficult. Actually, it's just as well you didn't use it because it's quite difficult to work with.
Yes, I see. But I do remember what I was going to ask you, and this really will be the end. I mean, you write recipes and people, and it's have a teaspoon of this and first catch your potlajan and, et cetera, et cetera. And then people make the dish and they say, well, this is no good or this is great. I mean, they can thank you or they can curse you. But I mean, the thing about recipes that upsets me is that people don't taste it. They don't actually see what they're doing as they go along. That maybe the author came from a country where the peppers tasted differently from where your peppers.
It's true.
I mean, how do you get praise or?
Well, sometimes I get on the whole I get praise, but sometimes I get I've had bad reviews, of course. I try not to let. I mean, sometimes the reviews are malicious. Yeah. And sometimes they have a point, but I tend not to be bothered either way. I mean, I'm delighted if people like my work, and I try to ignore when they don't like my work. But I think the point of a recipe, as you say, is that I can give you my recipe. You're not going to cook it like me, for sure. And if you don't taste, you're definitely not going to cook it like I wrote it. And also, if you're not attentive, like my sister, often she calls me and she says, I made this recipe, but it didn't work. So I tried to take her step by step, and then she misses one step. And I say to her, but I mean, obviously it's not going to work if you didn't do what I said you should do in step 5 or whatever. So sometimes they're not attentive, but tasting is key. But then if you're a very experienced cook like my mother, who's made kibbeh 1,000 times, she doesn't need to taste, because it's like, it's ingrained in her, like she knows how to do it. I used to do fattoush, which is a bread and herb salad, all the time at one stage. I didn't need to taste it. In fact, most of the time I make a salad, I don't need to taste it because I'm so used to making salads. And I know how much salt I use, unless I change the salt. Like if I'm using Maldon salt, which is flakes, it's different than if I'm using fleur de sel. So sometimes I need to adjust, the salt. But tasting is key to producing a good dish.
Yes. I mean, when I asked you whether you were creative, I mean, do you get a sense of, doing something and just being outside your own self when you're cooking and sort of. I mean,
sometimes I find cooking therapeutic, but I love it. I love the creation of a great dish, and if I fail, which I do sometimes if I'm rushing, it's very annoying. I mean, it's kind of frustrating because you've spent an hour or 2 hours producing something that in the end is not so good.
Well, you haven't failed us. I think we can count this conversation a success due to your charm and my plodding along trying to get answers out of you. Anyway, but thank you so much for participating, and you're always welcome back at Kiratani. You can cook us a meal.
Absolutely, I will.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.